Hello and good afternoon, and welcome to everyone who's joining us today to Viewing Room Live, Transporting Peoria, Past, Present, and Future. My name is Lottie Fittis, and I am the Curator of History and Registrar here at Peoria Riverfront Museum. Today's program will be recorded and available on the museum's YouTube page later. And today I have the great honor of welcoming two presenters. We have Mike Rucker and Chris Sweet. Mike is a Museum Visionary Society member and active supporter of the Peoria Riverfront Museum, and he led the campaign to bring back the Duryea, which raised money to bring back the Duryea that is now in the museum's collection to the Peoria area. And we are so grateful for that because that has allowed us the opportunity to continue sharing this really interesting story. And then we also have Chris Sweet, who is a information literacy librarian and associate professor at Illinois Wesleyan University and an avid historian of bicycle history in the central Illinois area. So I'm so grateful for both of them joining us today, and I hope you, the audience, and enjoy their information as well. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the talk using the comment section. We will answer those questions at the end of the presentation. And now I would like to turn it over to Chris Sweet to begin today's presentation.
All right, hello everybody. Give me just a minute. I will bring my slides up here. So part of the idea with our presentation here today is to kind of think about the early history of transportation in Peoria, from bicycles moving into automobiles. A couple of years ago, I did a longer version of this presentation at the Riverfront Museum that delved a lot more into some of the bicycle issues. We're going to try to keep this one fairly tight, compact. I'm going to move through these pretty quick, so save those questions until the end, and hopefully we'll have some good discussion at that time. So there's a rich history of cycling culture in Peoria. Sometimes you just need to know where to look. Particularly these signs, I think I took pictures of these are all from Peoria Heights, and Voss, Sieberling, Duryea are all associated with cycling, had factories at some point in time in Peoria Heights. Kingman was a dealer. Roos and Hazard started out as a dealer, then they made their own bicycles. And some of the remnants of these early factories, some of them still exist. This is a building that's up in the Peoria Heights right now. That's I believe that one is the Trefsker's Bakery. This is not the original Illinois Cycle and Fitness building, obviously, but they do have roots going back to the turn of the century. Another Roos and Hazard building from downtown Peoria, and this is the Luthi Gardens at the Luthi Botanical Gardens that have ties as well to cycling. So real quick, how did I end up here? How does one become interested in bicycle history? I've been in Central Illinois for most of my life. Undergraduate degree is in history. Library science is my master's degree. I started a substantial history project on the history of cycling in Illinois in 2015 that allowed me to travel around to a number of archives in the Midwest to begin this research. Hopefully it'll result in a book in a couple of years. I'm personally also a lifelong cyclist and triathlete, so I have this the experience as a participant as well. So like I said, the focus today is really going to be on the manufacturing side of things. as a historian, I'm really interested in social history. I really like how inventions, things impact social movements and social history. We're going to do a little bit less of that. We may talk about it a little bit at the end, just to stay focused on manufacturing and transportation. Next couple of slides, there's no good way to introduce you to Peoria bicycling history without at least touching upon how the bicycle developed. And this is not Peoria history, it's not United States history at the beginning. So the first thing that kind of looks a little bit like a bicycle, no pedals, is this thing called a draisine or a hobby horse. We're talking quite early here, 1817 in Germany. Why it's important is that it's got what's considered articulated front steering, so that front wheel actually turns. What that allows the rider to do is when you're riding, you're always correcting, and you're turning into a fall to keep yourself balanced. So that was the big innovation with this hobby horse. There were a few in the States. They never really caught on here. The next evolution of the bicycle, and they were called both bone shakers or velocipedes, same difference. This was Pierre Mouchot in Paris around 1863. Of course, the big evolution here is adding pedals to that front wheel so that it can be self-propelled. It's easier than running alongside it like you did with the hobby horse. These did make their way really quickly to the States. So they were just being developed and first being produced 1863, 64, 65. By 66, they were in Connecticut. 1868, there were velocipedes appearing in Illinois. Riding schools became popular, and there was a bit of the first bicycle craze that went through 1869. These were heavy bikes. They initially did not have any rubber tires on them, so the rims were either wood or steel, hence the name Bone Shaker. There's another evolution. It took a little while, but now 1870 all the way up until the early 1890s, these bikes that we know as high wheels or ordinaries or penny farthings, all names for this style of bike. So people always ask, well, why did the wheels get so large up front? Why isn't that dangerous? First of all, yes, it is dangerous. The tipping point on these is kind of directly over that front axle, so it's easy to go over the top. But they basically just wanted to keep going faster and hadn't figured out the chain drive. So they kept building a bigger wheel with one rotation of the pedals, you could go further and faster. The spoked wheels were another big innovation that gave it some cushioning and made the bike overall lighter. So this next one looks kind of like a modern bicycle in its basic design, right? This one has a slightly larger front tire and slightly smaller rear. This one is one of the first that looks like a modern bicycle, 1885. The big evolution here is that it's got a chain drive. Chain drive did a couple of things. It allowed you to shrink the wheel size down, get it close to the ground, so it was safer, hence the name safety bicycle. It also allowed you to take advantage of gear ratios. So you could gear it very easy for cruising around, riding hills. You wanted to go fast, you changed that the ratio in the sprockets there and could go faster. Pneumatic tires with air in them were added in 1888. Once the safety bicycle was developed, it created a large boom in the United States and in Illinois. So now let's bring this back home, first to Illinois, and then we'll get to Peoria. So what's happening in Illinois around this time? The first bicycle club, Chicago Bicycle Club, was founded in 1879. There was a huge race called the Pullman for the Pullman train cars in the Pullman, the section of Chicago where the workers lived. It attracted 100,000 spectators. Realized that Chicago was much smaller back then, so this was a very big spectator event. This quote's kind of important. 2/3 of the country's output of bicycles and accessories comes from within a radius of 150 miles around Chicago. Important for us today within that radius would be Peoria, all right? So that's within that radius. So manufacturing of bicycles and accessories was a big deal, at least for 10 or so years around this time period. The 1900 Census of Manufacturers lists 60 different Illinois manufacturers. The Chicago City Directory listed 300. So this was really before consolidation. Everybody wanted in on the game. Hardware stores were making their own bikes. Bicycle shops were making their own bikes. It's not the consolidation and monopolies that we're, or near monopolies that we're used to today. All right, getting us closer to Peoria. So in the 1890s, to put this in context, Peoria was the second largest city in Illinois, around 89,000 people. Why is it a major manufacturing hub? It's a matter of mostly geography, just like Chicago. It's got great proximity to rivers and railroads that allowed raw materials to come in, finished goods to go out. So that's the primary reason. During the 1890s, five major, I underlined major bicycle manufacturers in Peoria because there were a few others that did some small stuff, but these manufacturers all produced thousands of bikes over the course of their existence. And we'll just kind of briefly go through some of those. The first one, Luthi, you probably recognize it from that slide before. One of the remnants from this family and this manufacturer is the Luthi Botanical Gardens. They first did carriages and agricultural implements. Once this bicycle boom started happening, they're like, oh, well, we need to get in on this, right? And so they started building bicycles. And they were doing 1,000 to 2,000 bicycles a year for a while. They were popular enough to be exported around not just the States, but also internationally. So you will find some of these bikes still in Europe, and some of the posters and materials for advertising these bikes. Here's an example of a Luthi tandem. These were known as high art bicycles. These were not the cheapest ones. These were a lot of fancy fillet brazing, chrome nickel plating, the fancy cranks. They were after a high-end market with these with this style of bike. Bikes during this time, these high art bikes, they would have been $90, $100. A tandem probably $150. So many thousands in today's money. So it wasn't just bikes, there were also the accessories. So Peoria Rubber and Manufacturing, for a number of years, they were really one of the premier manufacturers of some early types of pneumatic tires. They were used on all kinds of bikes across the country. After the tires, they got into bikes too. They said, well, we're doing tires, we might as well do bikes. So they manufactured some of these, the Patty and the Atalanta. That's not a typo there. Atalanta was the name of the bike that was produced. 25,000 pairs of tires. Eventually, they did fall to a consolidation around 1899. Here's the manufacturing plant. This was in Peoria Heights. So originally built for Peoria Rubber and Manufacturing. Then it had a long manufacturing history after that. It's kind of interesting to see how these factories retooled. They were doing the Patty bicycles. Then Duryea Manufacturing Company was there. Peoria Buggy and Manufacturing, St. Louis Motor Carriage, the Glide, and then Pabst, Premier Malt Products, and then Pabst in the 1930s through the 1980s. This building is no longer in existence. This is one of the bikes that was manufactured by Peoria Rubber and Manufacturing. Patty it was Fred Patty. He was a rider and a racer that wanted to get into the bike building game. Not quite as fancy as the Luthi and the Ide, and they made a few less, 5,000 bicycles annually. A couple of things, the Patty Bicycle March, it was kind of common during this time to write pieces of music related to bicycles because they were so popular. The poster on the right was a Dutch poster about the Patty Peoria made bicycles. Another set of high art bicycles, this is a different company. This is called Ide. Ferdinand Ide was a watchmaker and a machinist. Same thing. He said, well, how hard can it be, right? I can make bikes. I can figure it out. So from 1893 to 1899, he made bikes. This was it was a watch factory. It became later Bradley's Siepert Hall, which is no longer in existence. But the same thing, this building was also used after bicycles. Bartholomew and Company used this building for early glide automobiles before they moved elsewhere. They employed up to 300 and made up to 3,000 bicycles annually. One more, Rouse Hazard and Company. They, like many others, they were a big agricultural implement dealer. That's how they got their start. And because they had that network established, they said, well, hey, we'll deal bicycles. People want them, easy enough, right? We'll take care, we'll do some bicycles. They're actually one of the oldest catalog wholesalers. They existed before Montgomery Ward's and Sears. And they were really big. Their warehouse in 1893, they said they had 3,800 bicycles in the warehouse. The showroom had 300 to 500 bicycles. They also were responsible. They worked with Charles Duryea to manufacture his Sylph and Overland bicycles. That's his design. The Sylph bicycle won the highest award at the Chicago World's Fair when it's displayed up there. This is the picture of me there at the bottom is me with a Sylph Model S. This is one that used to be on display at the Riverfront Museum and is part of the collection of a local collector. This is one of the ladies' Scorchers from Rouse and Hazard. This is a bike that I bought for my wife and restored. This is the downtown warehouse, just actually a few blocks away from the Riverfront Museum. I think it looks better than that now. I believe it's been reconfigured into something else once again. You can kind of see in this picture that I have here the arched windows from the original building that are still there, part of the current building. The Rouse and Hazard Peoria Heights factory, same thing. Here's an 1895 picture of it, and then a picture from a few years ago up in Peoria Heights. So I'm gonna start to move us forward now away from bicycles. So motorcycles is how the bridge to automobiles happened. And there's a little bit of Peoria history here. Charles Duryea had this design for a motor bicycle and an explosive engine. It's a really weird design. The engine is incorporated into that front wheel. I don't know that it ever went anywhere. I'm not even sure that it worked, although there's a picture of the prototype. A little more conventional motor on this one. This is the Pattee company again. They made one very small motor, but this is how motorcycles at first were just putting an engine on a bicycle, and then later they developed some of their own technologies. Another important step in this move towards automobiles is a great book out there called Roads Were Not Built for Cars by Carlton Reed. And it really examines how bicycles led and paved the way for automobiles. Roads just being one example. Most of the interstate highway system, this was advocated for by the League of American Wheelmen, LAW. So they were really the drivers behind getting decent roads in our country before automobiles became popular. So what about some technologies? These are technologies that were developed by the bicycle industry that made automobiles possible. Just a few of these: bearings, pneumatic tires, rack and pinion steering, wire spoked wheels, differential gearing. You see I've got a couple more listed here. These were direct transition to automobile manufacturing. So what are some what are the roots in automobile manufacturing? Who started out as a bicycle company and later became an automobile manufacturer? So some of these may not be surprising, but other ones: Cadillac, Chevrolet, Dodge, Ford, GMC, Jeep. These all had roots in one way or another in bicycle manufacturing before they became automobile companies. And that same book that roads are not, they have many pages at the back that covers probably 3 times this many. So most people, I think, just assume that automobiles caused the end of this bicycle boom. This is one of those cases where we need to be careful about correlation and causation. They're not really aligned if you look at the manufacturing periods. The bicycle boom was peaking in the late 1890s. But by that time, automobiles were really in their infancy. They weren't being mass produced, and not very many people had them. So it doesn't make sense that the automobile could kill the bicycle boom. So what really did? There was rampant overproduction. 300 manufacturers in Illinois. There were at least that many. And so there was just a huge oversupply, which tanked prices. People went out of business like crazy in the late 1890s that were in the bicycle business. And the ones that were left were consolidated into kind of these near monopolies, just a couple of really big bicycle manufacturing companies. More important, perhaps, is class and race issues. This is what a lot of people that study this bicycle boom think happened. So when anybody could afford a bicycle, they went from $100, and then Sears was selling them for close to $15, $20 over a 10 years time period. So by about 1900, you could buy a bike for about 15 bucks through a mail order catalog. It was no longer a status symbol. There was no elitism involved with it anymore. Anybody could afford them. Anybody could ride to work. They became a commuting vehicle, and so it lost its sort of panache for a lot of people. And so they moved on to other things. Motorcycles and automobiles, they definitely played a role, but it's not the major role. That's what I have on bikes, and I'm going to turn it over next to Mike.
Okay, thank you. Great job, Chris, as always. You always put on such a good presentation. What I'm going to focus on is a person whose name is well known in Peoria, and that's Charles Edgar Duryea. But this is going to be about his bicycle history. A lot of people know that he was very much involved in automobiles, and at a later date, I understand I'm going to be giving another presentation on Charles Duryea's automobile history. But he was born in 1861 in Canton, Illinois, and he was followed by a brother named James Frank, called Frank Duryea, 1869. They had one more brother whose name was Otto, O-H-T-O, and I cannot find a photo of him, but he was a significant engineer and inventor as well. He had a number of patents, but his primary patent was in railroad undercarriage for railroad cars. And he also tried once to start an automobile manufacturing business. So that's Otto, but I don't have any further information on him right now. Anyway, Charles' first involvement with bicycles was at age 18 when the family was living on a farm near Wyoming, Illinois, and he decided to build a bicycle out of scrap parts. It had a wooden frame. It had a 22-inch front wheel, which is off of a corn cultivator, obviously a metal wheel, and he had a toy wagon wheel on the rear. So you can picture what this strange thing must look like. And it was an ordinary bicycle. And Chris just mentioned, why it was called ordinary. That was the standard bicycle of the time. It was also, as Chris mentioned, called a penny farthing bicycle. And why was it called that? Well, you can see here, this large coin is a penny, and the small coin is a farthing. The farthing is 1/4 the value of a penny back in those days. So they called it a penny farthing bicycle. And Charles Duryea wrote in his memoirs that with this self-made bicycle, he could only ride it in the farmyard because the roads were pretty rough, and they had a huge mound in the middle where grass grew, because in those country roads, the wagon wheels would clear the way for the wheels, but then it was very difficult to ride because you couldn't get over that hump if you wanted to change direction in some way. So he wrote, though, in his memoirs that he was riding this in the family farmyard and he saw a kitten ahead of him about 100 feet away. The bicycle was very difficult to steer, and so he ran over the kitten. He wrote that. So Charles then had a number of different jobs, but in 1880, he was in St. Louis. He was working as a carpenter, and he got a job with a bicycle sales organization, and they were selling Columbia bicycles, and Columbia bicycles are still made today. In fact, my first bicycle at age 8, I shouldn't say this, but in 1948, was a Columbia and 24-inch. So Columbia at that time was a top of the line bicycle. Today, they're not considered to be a top of the line bike. They're more of a catalog type bike sold by, large stores like Sears and others. So anyway, he bought a secondhand ordinary bike, and he entered it in a race, first race he'd ever entered, and he had only 2 sets of clothes, so he wrote, and one set was his work clothes, and the other was his dress-up clothes with a jacket that had a double tail behind it, coat tail behind it. And so he rode in this race. He rode very, very fast, and his coattails were flying out behind him. The audience loved it. He put on quite a show for them, and he was named for this bicycle Duryea. He wrote that he didn't say he won the bike, the bicycle race. He said that he placed in the money, and which meant that he got a suit suitable for bicycle riding, which was a horse riding outfit. So horses in those days were still in the primary mind, not so much yet bicycles. But he was, for this race, he acquired the name Bicycle Duryea, and he was very proud of that. So while he was still in St. Louis, he made his first patent. He designed a new bicycle saddle. It's called a saddle because, once again, back to the reference to horses. And that was in 1884 that he did that. And he actually made some of them, didn't make much money. There was some problems with it in terms of whether or not it was an actual patent or not. And so he didn't make much money in it, but it was his first patent. It was his first of 61 patents. He was a very brilliant individual, very clever at designing things. And yes, he had a lot of patents. Here are just a few of them. The first is the bicycle saddle, and the next is an improved ordinary bicycle, handlebar, not a bike itself, but a handlebar for the penny farthing bike. He then, in 1890, made a spring frame safety bike design, and then following that, in 1900, an improved bicycle chain. And then, significantly, he also invented the first gummy liquid to go into tires, into pneumatic tires to seal punctures. In those days, there was still no inner tube. And although they were making pneumatic tires, primarily out of things like fire hoses and things of this sort, they were subject to punctures. And so Charles Duryea invented this liquid to puncture, to plug punctures. So those are some of his patents. Those apply to bicycles. So in 1880, he took a job as a bicycle repairman in Washington, D.C. He had learned about bicycle repairs from his job there in St. Louis with the Columbia bicycle sales organization there. So he learned of an opening in Washington. Somehow somebody told him about it. I think he applied there and got a job in Washington. Shortly, he moved back to Peoria at this time. He lived on Knoxville Avenue, and opened a bicycle repair business here in Peoria. But he only stayed here a short time because he then, well, I'll skip here. Chris covered this, and so I probably don't need to. So what invention led to the demand for improved roads? It was the safety bicycle, because you had to have good streets for it. One reason for the high wheel penny farthing front wheel being so big was because the roads were rough, and the larger the wheel, the easier it was to get over the bumps. But once people started getting safety bikes, then they demanded good roads. So he headed back to Washington, D.C. fairly promptly, and he worked for a man named H.S. Owens, who was manufacturing cycles. Here's an 1885 advertisement. And he was making these under license from a company in England who had the design. And I just love this advertisement here. Doesn't this make you really want to go out and buy a cycle? I mean, can you think of the logos that you could have with cycles? Both of these people kind of look kind of wacky, don't they? Anyway, Charles then designed a ladies' drop frame safety bike, because the women, with their skirts couldn't ride an ordinary bike. So Charles actually designed and built and patented a ladies' drop frame safety bike. And he took it to Owens, and Owens says, no, women will never ride. No, there's no way. One reason they couldn't ride is because it would expose their ankles. And at that point in time, about 1900 or so, late 1800, ladies were too modest to show their ankle. So anyway, here's Charles Durier's patent for a women's drop frame bicycle. And at this time, when he was in Washington, D.C., he began to audit patents at the U.S. Patent Office. He got a pass to do this. This is 1887 permit to go to the U.S. Patent Office and read patents. So he was constantly interested in patents, particularly of his own. As he was traveling back and forth between Washington, D.C. and Peoria, he stopped in 1887 at the Ohio State Fair, and he saw a stationary gasoline engine. Now, by this time, there had been automobiles, with gasoline engines made in Germany. And in 1887, though, he saw this one. It was an Otto engine, which is a fairly elementary, very early, very crude gasoline engine. But he saw it, and he thought to himself, okay, that's going to be the thing to power vehicles someday. And he wrote in his memoirs, then and there, I selected the internal combustion engine as the coming power. So he kept this in mind. Now he's going to start working on designing an engine. So while he was in Washington, he then organized the Duryea Manufacturing Company for the production of bicycles. This was in Washington. So apparently they did make a few. And he became involved with someone from Peoria named Harry G. Rouse, who was a bicycle manufacturer in Peoria. And they became involved. And so they had some contact somehow with the Ames Manufacturing Company in Massachusetts. And Rouse and Duryea contracted with Ames to build his Stealth, SYLPH, Stealth safety bicycle. And however, it didn't work out very well. The Ames people didn't treat them well. So Rouse said, well, why don't you come to Peoria? We'll start manufacturing your Stealth bicycle in Peoria Heights under the name of Rouse and Hazard. So Charles came back to Peoria. And this is a brochure, some words from a brochure from Rouse and Hazard. Our Mr. C.E. Duryea is well known as one of the most prolific practical cycles inventors in America, and the originator of number cycling features of great value. So this is an ad from Scientific American, Rouse Hazard Company, the Stealth bicycle. And if you're probably wondering what a self is, well, I was. So a self is a fairy or a graceful, slender, graceful woman or girl. And they live in the sky, fly freely wherever they wish. So here's an actual picture of a stealth, so you know there's such a thing. Good name for a bicycle, I think. So there it is. And here's the stealth, of course, in front of an advertisement. Now, about this time, something significant happened for women's fashion. Bloomers. Instead of having to wear a long skirt all the time, women could now wear bloomers. They could cover up their ankles and not be criticized. And so the women's safety bike, drop frame safety bike, was now practical for them. So here's once again his patent for the drop frame bike. So this bike is interesting. It's got springs there you can see in two different places, horizontally and vertically to try to give a better ride. And once again, back to Rouse Hazard and self bikes. So this was the Rouse Hazard factory in Peoria Heights. It was built in 1895. It had 350 employees. And you know what it is now? It's Tresker's Bakery. And Chris showed some of these signs. These are the various signs that relate in Peoria Heights that relate to bicycle manufacturing. These streets were named after them. And Chris showed a photo of this. I mentioned this only because on the third floor of this building in downtown Peoria, which was the Cohen Furniture Company, they had a riding circle where they could teach people to ride, particularly women. They were focused on teaching women how to ride their drop frame women's bike, and along with having an inventory of bicycles there. So you can see Rouse Hazard there on the front of the building. Now, while this was all happening here in Peoria, Frank was back in Peoria, back in Massachusetts, working on this engine that Charles had designed, trying to put it into a vehicle and make it run. This is a women's Phaeton vehicle that Charles brought and provided, for the purpose. And so Frank worked on this thing for constantly. He became ill. He wasn't getting paid very much at all. And he continued to work and found that Charles' design just didn't work. And so finally he was successful though. He put it in the vehicle and it finally ran. So the first time it ran, they were on the second floor of a manufacturing building, and they started the engine. The carriage, the vehicle started rolling forward, of course, under power, and they had not thought to put any brakes on it. They were trying so hard to make it run, they hadn't thought about brakes, and it was heading straight for the wall of the second-story building. So the workman and Frank had to grab it by the wheels, drag it back, shut off the engine, and then after that, they took it down to the street level and proved it worked and had photographs taken. And this was the second, this was built by Frank, of course, while Charles was in Peoria. And it was the second gasoline-powered vehicle in America, not the first, but the second. So Charles then went straight back to Massachusetts, and the two of them started the America's first automobile manufacturing factory. And this is really their point in history. They made 13 of these vehicles and sold them, but it only lasted a couple of years, and the company was sold to the National Motor Carriage Company. So then Charles headed straight back to Peoria, where he then continued to work on automobiles. And from 1898 to 1917, Charles focused on automobiles, not bicycles. And this, of course, is the vehicle we have here at the Peoria Riverfront Museum. And this is, we'll have a new location here in the museum. And here's John Barks on the right, who was very much involved with us in bringing us back to Peoria. And John Morris, of course, whom you know. And I was a person who went out to Princeton, New Jersey, and somehow was talked into signing the agreement to bring this vehicle back to Peoria for $125,000. And it was very traumatic, but now we're glad we have it. So that's the end of my presentation relating to Charles Durier's bicycle history. Okay. Any questions?
Yes, hold on, Mike, one moment. Okay, hello, welcome back. So Mike, if you could go ahead and click end or stop screen sharing. Oh, actually, I can do it.
Okay.
There we go. Wonderful. Okay. Lottie had to step away for a moment. I'm Heather Placco, the program manager, and we're going to finish up with a couple quick questions to our speakers. Thank you so much, gentlemen. That was fabulous. So a couple of questions Lottie and I had been pondering when we were prepping for this program is in the advertisements for bicycles, it's notable that women seem to be prevalently featured as the primary riders of the bicycle. Could either of you speak to that?
Sure, I can take a stab at getting us started here. It really depends on what time period you're looking at. We're really talking about the bicycle boom in the 1890s, and so part of that boom was driven by reaching out to a different demographic, so getting women to ride, which they did not do much of it during the high wheel era. High wheels, as I said, they were quite dangerous given social norms of the time. Straddling a high wheel was seen as unladylike, so they didn't. Not many women rode the high wheel bicycle. So in part, it was the safer design. But why did the manufacturers? There's probably two major reasons. And the first, perhaps more cynical reason, is that they wanted to sell bikes. And so they saw a demographic that did not own bikes. Women didn't have them. So yeah, well, we've already sold enough bikes to the men. They're not buying anymore. How can we sell more? So we can reach out. We can advertise women. And there was, to a lesser degree, there was a children's market as well. After they kind of saturated the women's market as well, they're like, well, we'll make children's bikes and tricycles and things for kids. So I think that is definitely part of it. The other half, the less cynical half, is that there were a lot of these bicycle organizations and clubs, and they started out as men's organizations, but they wanted their girlfriends and their significant others to ride, so they started forming women's auxiliaries, and they legitimately just wanted to share this new sport with women. So, you know, I think those are the two big pieces about why during this time period you see so many women in advertisements.
Sure.
I have a little comment on that. I believe it was Ames in Massachusetts who began manufacturing some of Charles Durier's bicycles, and he or someone else, I forget for certain, I need to reference it, made the statement that he liked the idea of the ladies' bike with the drop frame design. He said, if we can get women to start riding bicycles, every old buck in the country is going to start wanting to ride along with them. So yeah, so that was a motivation as well.
Yeah, I could see that. Absolutely. So I have a question about the bicycles and did the cars really kill the boom of bicycles? But I think, Chris, you already answered that. So I'm going to skip down to our next question. During the height of the pandemic, it was very difficult to find a bicycle to buy anywhere in the country. And in our current climate coming out of the pandemic, do you foresee people continuing with that trend of going back to older modes of transportation?
Well, I was just looking at the current Rails to Trails magazine just this week, and the sales of bicycles have gone through the roof, as we know, but the number of people using trails and bicyclists, of course, as well as jogging and hiking on trails, has expanded greatly during the pandemic. And it's believed that one reason is so many communities are now trying to build trails. For instance, just right now, this last week, East Peoria is planning to build a 12-mile loop trail through East Peoria with a link between the McCluggage Bridge and Bob Michael Bridge. And this is just one example, but there's lots of other examples in our area here of trails being under development. And it's believed that the pandemic being, during the shutdown, people became more interested in trails and biking. So yes, I think that's true.
I can add in that the bicycle manufacturing, I'm not sure what other industries are quite as cyclical in the boom and bust cycles as cycling has been. So the biggest of the booms was this 1890s. There's never been another one as big as that. And it went away. The bicycles started to come back again in like the 30s. They developed a balloon tire, so a wider, softer tire for the bicycles that made them, they're heavy, but they were more comfortable to ride, easier to steer, that sort of thing. Then after World War II, there was another boom where it kind of became popular among teens. These bicycles that had a lot of chrome on them, they kind of mimicked the cars of the day. And so, teens and preteens wanted to ride them before they could get like a motorcycle or a car or something. So then, kind of another bust cycle for quite a few years. The next boom would have been with like the 70s and the Arab oil embargo, the rise of the environmental movement. People saw bicycles as a tool to cut down on pollution. There was a big boom. Then it kind of went away again. BMX got hot in the early 80s, followed by mountain bikes, late 80s, early 90s. But it's always been cyclical. It's always been, either running like gangbusters or not selling any bikes. And then overproduction can still get us. We're much more precise in our demand and our numbers now. But I'm sure that right now everybody's like, oh, we're selling every bike we can get out the door. There's almost always a little bit of an overproduction cycle that follows that. So I think people will keep riding post-pandemic. The boom, there's only so many people you can sell bikes to, and a lot of them have bought those bikes. So the boom will not last too long.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's kind of probably reached its peak and is on the way back down at this point.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hopefully we can see some other good things like bike repair shops and things like that popping up to help keep these bikes up in shape.
Sure.
Okay, so what are some of the biggest changes we've seen in bicycles since first use, since they have come about?
The biggest one, and I didn't talk about this because it kind of happened after the 1890s, was the advent of a derailleur, the ability to shift a bicycle. A lot of these early ones that we were looking at, actually everything that we had pictures of would have been a fixed gear. So you brake just by putting like back pressure on your pedals to slow it down. It's actually quite hard on your knees and it's harder to control. It's not that safe. Some of them did have like a spoon brake to help you slow down. So the first big development then was a freewheel, which allowed you to coast. So the mechanism engages in one direction when you're pedaling and then releases while you're coasting. So that was a big one. The derailleur then allowed you to shift gears between an easier gear and a harder gear, so you're not having to push your bike up a big hill or something like that. Earlier on, and we did touch on this, pneumatic tires were so much more comfortable than the hard rubber tires. It really made a difference. They were faster. They gave it a more cushioned ride. So those pneumatic tires. Then really, brakes got a little bit better over time. Eventually we moved to like disc brakes. There were certainly refinements. People started building bikes out of aluminum, and then they started building bikes out of carbon fiber. None of those are big advances. Probably the next big advance, would be the e-bikes, which have become popular in the last decade. So battery-powered bicycles, which kind of cross the line between a small moped, but you can still pedal them like a bicycle. I think that's the most modern, updating of the bicycle.
Do you happen to know, Chris? I know it's popular now to get toddlers those bicycles with no wheels or no pedals at all. They're like balance bikes.
Yep.
Do you know if those have been around for a long time or if they're a newer thought process to help kids understand balancing on a bicycle?
Yeah, that was kind of a new market segment. It's a good idea, just to take one item out of the equation. A lot of them you can like add the pedals back on later if you want. It's the hobby horse design, right? It's the very first slide I showed from 1817. A bicycle without pedals, just to learn the balance element of it. And no, nobody was manufacturing them. I think a lot of us that worked on bikes knew you could pull a crank off pretty easy and make some of these. I've seen some of those, but it was a market segment that was missing, and that company Stride started to make them, and then it doesn't take long anymore. A year later, 50 companies were offering some version of a balance bike.
Sure. Well, that makes sense. Okay, so we're early. This is kind of a question for both of you, and we've touched on it a little bit, but just to go a little more in depth, were early bicycles and early automobiles safe? Or what were some of the hazards with them?
The first automobile accident in America happened in New York in 1894, I believe it was. And it's when a motorist driving a Duryea struck a bicyclist, broke his leg. And so the motorist, of course, was arrested and put in jail overnight. So from the very beginning, there was some hazard between the two.
It's interesting that was the first car accident, was a bicycle.
Yep.
As far as bikes, I mentioned the penny farthing, the high wheel bicycle, and anybody looking at that can see why it's dangerous. It puts you really up high. It's quite easy, even if you know you're going to fall, to still break a collarbone, to break a wrist falling off of one of those style of bicycles. So the safety, it put you closer to the ground. What did they have to contend with? Other than the bicycle itself, it was the very poor condition of the roads, and these were mostly ridden in urban areas. So they had to deal with like trolley cars. They had to deal with teamsters and horses pulling carts. So I mean, I've seen a lot of accounts of accidents that happened from bicycles. I mean, the horses were not used to them on the streets. It tended to spook the horses. The roads were in terrible condition, trying to ride across tracks and this kind of stuff. So they made pretty durable bikes, as a testament that you can still find some of them and still ride some of them from that time period. It's more the conditions that they were trying to ride them in that were challenging.
Yeah, absolutely.
One boom that safety bikes created once they became popular was the paving brick industry. And millions and millions, billions of paving bricks were created, to make smooth streets. And in Peoria, there were hundreds of, many, many miles of paved brick streets. And when they started being replaced, they were bought up by Bill Rutherford, and a large part of them taken to Wildlife Prairie Park. So when you go to Wildlife Prairie Park and you see all those hundreds and thousands of paving bricks, Purrington pavers there at Wildlife Prairie Park, they used to be on the streets of Peoria. Now there are still some streets in Peoria up near Glen Oak Park that still have the paving bricks. And there's been proposals a number of times when the city said, well, we want to take those up now at this late date and put down a asphalt street. And the neighbors in that area all say, no, we like our brick street. I think they're very charming. So that was another industry that came about as a result of the safety bike.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes total sense. Yeah, the charm of a brick street can't be understated, even though now a lot of them are pretty bumpy and lumpy when you drive down them.
Yeah, but they were better than what they were before.
Yeah, absolutely. So are there any automobile manufacturers that we kind of talked about today, or that are in existence, that are still producing bicycles? Because I know there was a correlation between the two industries in that regard. And why do you think they moved away from it and solely would focus on the automobile industry and kind of release the bicycle industry?
Well, they moved on because there was no money in bicycles at that time period. The market was oversaturated. And the margins were so thin. Once like Sears and Montgomery Ward started selling them through their catalogs, it just, where they're making like $1 per bike as a profit margin, there was no profit in it anymore. So I mean, that's answers why they moved them away. The more interesting question, are there any that still try to do both? I don't think so. I think every now and then they'll do like promotional. I've seen like a Hummer branded bike that was sold with the Hummer vehicles and stuff, but I'm sure they had somebody else make that for them.
The only one I know is Peugeot.
Okay.
They make both automobiles and bikes. Good bikes.
Sure.
Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in. Do you guys have any other questions you're interested in talking about or answering before we wrap up?
I would just mention anyone in Peoria area who's interested in bicycles and trails and all that, they might want to log on to bikepeoria.org. Bike Peoria is a dynamic organization that's doing a lot to promote biking and trails here in Central Illinois. And so if people are interested, check it out, bikepeoria.org.
I think I would just like to make a plug for local history. It's been great getting into this line of research and not only visiting the libraries and the museums and the archives to find these materials, but to find, when I didn't know how much still existed in the Peoria area as far as the locations, the buildings, even some of the organizations that existed more than 100 years ago and have persisted. And I think it's a much more hands-on, real way of teaching history than you get in the classroom. And so getting some exposure to that, going out and finding these locations, the little plaques where things used to be. I think that hunt is fun. I think it's a good thing to get kids, young adults into, as well as just anyone that has an interest in local history.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for your fabulous presentations. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for our program. A quick reminder that if you haven't gotten a chance to see the museum's 101 Treasures exhibition, you can see the Duryea automobile there. And that will be running through the end of July, I believe. And a special thank you to museum members and Visionary Society members. And thank you to Mike and Chris for taking the time to speak with us today and sharing your knowledge and research with our community. Have a great day.
Thank you very much for having us.